I'm recording. So Audre Lorde is a phenomenal speaker, was a phenomenal speaker, poet. Her work is awesome. But the reason why I personally started speaking out on these issues, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my background, is just because of this quote, right? When we speak, we're afraid that our words won't be heard or welcome, but when we're silent, we're still afraid. So it's better to speak and be afraid. And so that's one of the principles that definitely guides me in the work that I do. So a little bit more, is my screen not advancing? Here we go. So a little bit more about me. So I have been working in higher education for 15 years. I've been at Penn State Abington for 1 year as a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, known as ODE. On campus, I identify as a myriad of different things, but mainly Christian, queer, woman, mom, wife, aunt, all of that good stuff. And I started speaking nationally about 7 years ago, just because I found that I really had a love for having dialogue with people who just have a diversity of thought, right? And being able to share my experiences as well as inspire students. And so I've traveled and I've spoken at some really great universities and met some really remarkable students. But I always say, these are my experiences. This is not, the end all be all. And so you all have a wealth of knowledge as well. So I hope that some of you will share, because this is definitely a dialogue. Some fun facts about me: I own a cupcake business. Some people know that, which is pretty fun. And I also took my advocacy to the culinary world, where I support underrepresented chefs and bakers by way of my food and dessert expo. So just a little bit about me. Today, what I hope to accomplish in an hour won't get accomplished. I'll say that from the start. But what I hope is that we can at least tackle these words that we easily put together, like racism and bias and privilege. Like, I feel like if we can kind of start there, understanding those three, that'll be great. My hope is that we get to number 4, right, in ways that you can combat everyday racism. And kind of talk a little bit about that. It's really hard to talk about racism without tackling the other issues, but I have a workshop coming up on privilege and a workshop coming up on microaggression. So I'm not going to focus on those here, but as you can imagine, like, they all come up, right? So that's, one of the things that is going to happen, but I'm going to really try to stick to racism and bias for the point of today. So let's just jump right in. So before we talk about our pre-questions, what is racism? Like, the definition. And this is so big because there's so many definitions, but does someone want to give it a shot with just defining what racism is? And don't worry about being right or wrong, just looking for participation and thoughts. So what is racism? Anyone?
It's
Sorry.
discrimination against someone.
Yes, so discrimination against someone, usually by a people, a place, or a group, right? So many people have defined it in the past, but I want to point out Claire and Dennis's definition of it in their piece, Sociology on Racism. It's the individual or group level process or structure that's implicated and reproduced by racial inequality. So, right, what does that mean, right? I'm more about, like, what does it look like in practical terms? And that's why I like to talk about everyday racism. Like, how are people of color experiencing racism every day? Not with, like, the Webster dictionary is, but I like to bring those out. Systematic racism, super important. I feel like those two conflate, especially because I've been working in higher ed for 15 years. So working in a larger business, school, corporation, and looking at how racism takes place within a system. And that's where you work at, where you go to school at, and then of course our government, right? And so really thinking about how those go hand in hand. So I just wanted to make sure that we leave those here so we can think about it. But these are the pre-questions. And so I would love to hear at least one person quickly just answer them. That would be great. And hopefully these are something some of you got to think a little bit about. But would someone like to share their earliest memory of racism? Because this is very important as we will talk about implicit bias and where it all started at personally for us. Anyone?
I'm a few years older than most of you, but my first year in college, I'm a Pennsylvania native. I went to college down in North Carolina, and decent sized town, not a major city, but I was in school for about 2-3 weeks, and then there's on the front page of the newspaper, there's a little like shaded box that said this Saturday there will be a Ku Klux Klan march through downtown Salisbury, North Carolina, and I was that was just crazy talk to me. I just didn't. That was for me the most blatant first experience with it. Kind of sad. I was 18 until I had my first real experience with it, but that for me that just kind of smacked me in the face.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. Probably predates some of us, but it's very like good to like put ourselves in that thought and to be back there. And then I can't, imagine, but I've heard stories from my mom and my grandmom as well. How about number 2? How can someone explain how they believe privilege and power kind of inform racism? I know that's like loaded, but someone want to give it a shot? Anyone took some thought about it? Anyone? Okay, so we'll skip it. How about number 3? Institutional racism, or that systematic racism we just talked about. How do you all, and we have a number of students here, give me a thumbs up if you're a student, just so that we can kind of see if folks are looking at the gallery view. Give me a thumbs up if you're a student. Awesome. See how many students are here? Awesome. So half our participants are students. How do you think institutional racism impacts you all here? Because we can talk about what's going on in the world outside of where we're at, but I like to talk real about your experiences. How does it impact you all at this level? Come on, y'all. We're here to talk today. Can someone give some thoughts?
Okay. I have a couple of thoughts. I don't have like a complete sentence, but
yeah, I just want to hear you. That's perfect.
I feel like it will affect our comfortability. I feel like no one is maybe here with us or here to walk us through the process, or we wouldn't get, I would say, the upper hand, I would say. Because I had experiences where, no, I haven't been faced with racism, but I know what it feels like to get the short end of the stick when it comes to some things. So I feel like that can play a part at an institution, or even with high school. I've experienced racist high schools where I guess a white kid would get the upper hand than a black kid, and it wouldn't be fair because they're both in the same position. So I feel like that's how it will affect people.
There's so many things go into that, right? Geographic, like where you're located at, right? The makeup of that. And my office specifically, if you're familiar or not familiar with O'Day, we're specifically charged with supporting students of color. So I get face-to-face daily interactions and get to talk to students about their everyday experiences. And the first piece is just they want to see people who work at institutions that look like them. Right. And so Penn State Abington prides itself on being very diverse, but you want to have faculty and staff that kind of mirror that diversity that we want in our students. So really thinking about that. So I'm going to jump on to the next slide, but thank you so much for sharing. So I talked to you about these, but we're going to try to touch on a few of these. So let's just jump right in. If we were in person, the one thing I would tell you about conversations about racism is when you're doing the work, which we like to call anti-racist work, right? And trying to unpack some of the things that you've learned or unlearned, you need an accountability buddy, right? So if we were together, I would pair you off right now, but just make sure that if this is work that you're really trying to do. So if you're not a person of color, so a white person, and you're really trying to work on this, you need an accountability partner, preferably a person of color, that can kind of help you as you walk through trying to learn and really be an ally. So just something to think about. So just make sure that you have one. And then I would have you check in. So I kept these in this presentation because it's important before you even have these conversations that you check in. And you know, because sometimes you're not even in a mood and you're all here today, and I appreciate that, but you could have gotten into an accident, you know, or your mom's getting on your nerves, or, you know, you didn't pass your test yesterday. So you want to always unpack your personal stuff before you try to jump into before you try to jump into like a rich conversation like racism. And then ultimately, the main thing that we would do is set ground rules, right? And so I want to put these into the space as you move forward, because this can't be the only conversation you're having about racism. Pretty sure that most of you are talking about it in some way, shape, or form, maybe with family, friends, or in your class. Ground rules are one of those things that we want to set because we're hoping that they help kind of set the stage for like our community, like for how we're going to act. And so you probably have heard people say this is a safe space. So I don't really declare that. I declare that spaces are brave. So we're brave enough to have these conversations. But I want you to take a look at this list of ground rules, because before you have these conversations, these are some things that you need to be comfortable with. I'll just point out a few that are definitely ones that, you know, in the past I've done talks like this with over 200 people, right? But the step number 3, which would be step up and step back. So usually if you are the voice in a conversation like this, you want to say less, right? And be able to kind of take a step back. And if you don't usually talk, maybe today is a day that you would talk. Expect to experience discomfort is a big one for me. If you get uncomfortable anytime during this session, that is where I want you to be, right? I want you to be at that point of discomfort, because that is where you're like, whoa, like this is not right. Like this doesn't feel good. And then I want you to lean into why. You know, and then lastly, respecting confidentiality, and I think it's on here somewhere, but making sure you speak just to your story, right? No one is speaking for the voice of everyone. So those are just some general rules, but we want to definitely move through. So I want to start right here with implicit bias, right? Let's just jump right in. We cannot talk about racism without starting at implicit bias. So can someone take a shot and tell me what it is? What is implicit bias? Come on, y'all. Y'all here with me? Go ahead. Yep, you raised your hand. I'm sorry. I have you on 3 different screens, so you can just unmute yourself and talk. Perfect.
Okay. My name is Crystal Maldonado. I'm a senior here at Abington, and this is actually my first ODAY workshop, so it's really good to be here with everyone. Implicit bias, from what I've experienced and learned, implicit bias is kind of those little underlying unconscious prejudices that are all taught to everyone throughout growing up in childhood, whether your family exposes you to something that you're not really taught to kind of focus on. It's more so just you're there, you learned about it, so you rely back on that generalization of something.
Yes, absolutely. Right. It could be very unconscious or conscious, but it's something that's learned, right? You think about like, where did you learn about these communities of people, whatever that may be? So I told you all I identify as queer. So in the work I do for LGBT folks, I always ask people, when did you first learn what it meant to be gay, right? And what did you learn about gay people? Because for me, it was that gay people were going to hell. Right. And I remember learning that very early on. That was the first thing I learned, and that's all I knew. How about when I figured out like I like girls, but I'm going to hell, like the conflict, right? Same thing with race, right? When did we learn about races that were different than ours? So thank you, Crystal. So glad you're here with us today. Can someone give me a real life example of an implicit bias? Real life example.
I would say maybe if somebody crosses the street when they see a person of color approaching them and they don't even think about it, they just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Antonio. Absolutely. And I'm going to click to the next slide because I want to jump right in. I really don't do a lot of words on a slide, but I need you all to read this so you really understand what I'm talking about. I want to make sure that it makes sense, right? So bias is like this thought, right? And the thought leads to the action, right? And so a person could be unconsciously or consciously think that people of color are more likely to be dangerous, right? And so maybe if you think that, you have some anxiety, right? And you're just like, that the anxiety stems from a bias. But when that anxiety turns into an action, just like Antonio just said, like crossing the street, then that's when it turns into racism. So these are examples of racist actions, right? So a person crossing the street to avoid a group of young men. If a person calls 911 to report a person of color, right, who's not doing anything at all. A police officer shooting an unarmed person of color because they fear for his life, right? If you saw the movie The Hate They Give Us, the young man was getting a brush out of his car and the police officer automatically thought that he was getting a gun and shot him. So it's the action. So it's very important to understand that bias is our belief, and we may have feelings and emotions attached to that, but when we act on that, that's racism, right? So, or discrimination. Thoughts, questions, does that make sense? Can I get some head nods, thumbs up? Y'all with me? Okay. All right, awesome. So really important. And because of those racist actions, what is really happening in this world right now is racialization, right? It's basically grouping a group of people based on their race and their skin tone and saying that they're all like this, right? And we all know we have lots of different identities. If we don't want to be grouped, right? Stereotypes are based on these implicit bias that we really don't know is true until we really get to know people, right? And so this kind of grouping of people has historically always dates back to slavery. And so really thinking about the history of this, okay? Like I said, a lot of words before, but really read this, right? Really think about how groups of people were pretty much marginalized and said that they were bad and treated fundamentally different, right? Trauma, displacement, cruel treatment, all those things, right? Really is what gives birth to white privilege. And I'm not going to talk a lot about privilege today, but we have to understand that bias leads to racism and discrimination, and racism and discrimination leads to privilege, white privilege specifically. All right, talk to me. Does that make sense? All right, and remember, I'm going to give you a copy of this, but it's very important. I want to read the second piece of this out loud because I hear this so much, right? And so while not all white people participated directly in the mistreatment of people of color, their learned biases and the safety from that treatment led many to be one of the things that's the primary reason racism still exists: silence, right? So I'm quiet because this doesn't matter to me, because I'm safe, right? And so what we need is more people to talk about the inequalities that exist when they see it, but it's learned, right? And so it's something that needs to change. And people always ask, what can I do? And my one thing would be educate yourself and then talk more, right? And so really, really thinking about that. And then the first piece of it is just doing the work within yourself. Like really starting with, have you ever sat down and thought about all of your identities? Give me a thumbs up if you've ever did a social identity activity where you looked at all of your identities and your privileges. Anyone? Give me a thumbs up. You have some reactions at the bottom. Anyone? Okay, you have. Awesome. And so this social identity activity will, of course, we were together and we had more time, I would delve into this. And my questions I would ask once you identify your identity in each of these areas is, I would ask you, which of your identities do you think about the most, right? So someone tell me, do you think about your privileged identities or your oppressed identities the most? Which ones?
Privileged.
Anyone else?
Oppressed.
That might be your, sorry, I shouldn't say Vanita. I should say maybe that's your experience. But as I do this activity with hundreds of people, you think about your oppressed identities more. Well, more people think about their oppressed identities because those are the things that affect them more, right? So I think about the things that are being taken away from me more than I think about the areas that I'm privileged in. Because if I'm privileged and I'm just driving down the street, every time I see a cop, I don't even think twice. right? Does that make sense? When I'm going through, schools are closed, right? So I'm going through school zones and it's 15 miles per hour, but we know the school is closed and I'm looking at all the cars swerving around me. I'm sorry, I'm going 15 miles per hour because I'm going to get stopped for driving while black through a school zone. So I think twice about things, right? When I go into stores, I no longer take big pocketbooks. Not sure how many of my white friends who carry pocketbooks think about the size of their bag. But every time I have a big pocketbook, I feel like I'm being watched more in a store when I'm shopping, right? So I think about those things that get taken away or make me othered more. So just a thought. So social identity wheel activity, if you haven't done it, add that to your homework list. But let's stop here and think about some of these questions, because this first question is the reason why we don't have a lot of these conversations, right? So tell me about your fear and anxiety and how that keeps you from having conversations about race. Why don't folks want to talk about race? Come on, someone be vulnerable and transparent with me.
I think it's probably because it's like we have like very we all came from very different backgrounds and like cultures, and like in the US it's like we're very diverse when it comes to race, and people don't want, like, people get pressure from talking about it, like in school or in workplace, like it just a lot of pressure to talk about it, about their view on it.
Yep, absolutely. A lot of pressure comes from it, right? If I talk about race, that must mean I'm racist, right? If I talk about racism, right? That's definitely not it. What else? Someone else give me a thought. What fears and anxieties keep us from having conversations about race?
For me, I am in a rural area,
Yeah.
all white, and so there is a preconception in this area against minorities. And
Okay.
so if I want to speak out and ask about it or learn more about that or educate myself about it, there's really no one I can talk to unless I'm like in a seminar like this where I can actually speak to people with different cultures. But that's it for me.
Yeah. So your environment, right? I don't know if anyone has ever been in a predominantly white environment, but I've been places to speak. And the thought is that, like, we don't talk about that here. Like, that's not an issue for us here. And so those are the places where we need to talk about it more. Do you know that in 2020, there are still students that come to Penn State Abington to live and they do not want a roommate that's a person of color? That is still a thing. That is still a thing. Finding out your roommate is Black or Asian or Indian, and then saying, I want a room change because of race, right? This is a thing, and it's been happening. And so people come from different parts of the world where there is no racial diversity, and it's just like, I don't know what to do, which is why I implore you all in college to take advantage of the opportunities that allow you to be culturally competent and really engage in communities that are not like yours. Not just about race. Race is not a Black and a white thing. It's not, right? So the history of it looks different. And so I think my friend Clever at the beginning said that conversations about racism always turn to Black and white. And I think that's because the historical root of racism is around white people and Black people specifically. But what we know is that there's so much to it, right? About our land and indigenous land that we live on, and who were the first people to occupy the land, and how power informs all of those conversations. So I can go on for hours, but I won't. I'm going to keep us moving. But your comfort zone, right? And so where the magic happens, right? But that comfort zone is the peace. I love when I'm presenting and people seem like super uncomfortable. I'm like, talk to me about it. I can't see you all like I wish I could. But if you're uncomfortable at any point, always ask yourself, really, like, why am I uncomfortable? Like, what did Anissa just say that made me like, ooh, right? And ask yourself and talk about it, because that's how it happened. That's how these conversations happen and how things change. Who knows who this person is? Anyone? Thumbs up, wave. Peggy McIntosh? Anyone? What is she famous for? Has anyone heard of Peggy McIntosh? Oh my gosh, y'all got homework to do. So Peggy McIntosh in 1988. I don't think any of y'all were born. Maybe some of y'all. I was 8. Yes, me and you, Chris. So I was 8. But in 1988, Peggy McIntosh started her work on white privilege. She's still alive and still doing some amazing things. But she put out a list basically that made it tangible to explain ways in which white people experience privilege. Because it's one thing to say like you experience privilege, but what I like people to do is give me a list. Have you ever thought about the ways in which you experience privilege because of your race, right? And what Peggy McIntosh is put out a list that's one of the most used lists of white privilege. She also put out a lot of literature called Unpacking, I think, the Invisible Knapsack, right? Which was about all the stuff that we're carrying, white folks are carrying specifically about race. And it's so good. So please learn a little bit about Peggy McIntosh, but she has so many quotes, but I love this. The power from unearned privilege can look like strength when it's in fact permission to escape or to dominate. Right? And so privilege is not one of those things like I have lots of white friends, right? It's not one of those things that you wake up and you're like, today I'm going to have privilege, right? No, right? You earned it like by just because of your skin color, like you walk a very different life than I walk, right? But it doesn't mean that you have to kind of confer to that, right? You have to kind of stop there. The power is in your privilege, right? And how you kind of fight back. So here are a couple of my favorites from her, and thinking about white privilege, really thinking about that you can think about these. So 14, 15, I love all of them, but I love number 14 because I'm a mom. So I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them, right? So this is a white people, something you don't have to think about. You know, for me, I've been preparing my son for a world that is just going to look at him and like I feel like they stopped seeing him as cute when he was probably about 5, right? I think one of the YouTube videos I sent you, she talked about her son and how you say a baby is cute, but when do you stop seeing we're going to say a black man, because my son will be 14 on Sunday and he's almost 6 feet tall. Like, when do you now see him as a threat, right? But I have personally been preparing my son for this world that doesn't see him as just him. And the majority of my son's friends are white. We live in the white suburbs. He goes to a predominantly white middle school, right? But I need him to understand that if they go into a store and God forbid take something, he's going to be treated different than his white friend is going to be treated. Why do I have to like prepare my son for this, right? Thinking about this, thinking about number 17, sorry, those two are together, but the way you dress, right? What you say, you know, the way you respond, people make it indicative to, oh, you know, they're just poor or uneducated, right? I just hate that, right? And so thinking about this, so check out that list, that white privilege list is everything. But it's a great way to kind of like put it together. When I do the privilege one-on-one workshop, we're talking about all privilege. So I won't just talk about white privilege. So I wanted to bring this up here. All right, I want to stop there. Anyone have questions, thoughts, comments, anything to contribute?
I do.
Yes.
My friend, it's just a thought that popped in my head. We were on the same topic, racism, and she's a dark-skinned woman, African-American woman. She's in her 20s and she has a child. And she gets a lot of backlash because she is dark-skinned. And so she said something that I never thought of in that way. So she said that she would never date a white man because her son is a black man, and she said that a white man couldn't teach her black son how to grow up in a world like this, or society, I would say, and how to face stuff like this. Although he could teach him, you know, things to do or not, he could not put himself in that position to feel what it's like, I would say.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it that way. It's like, yeah, you got a point. You have a real point. So I just wanted to share that because I looked at it a different way after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's talked about all the time, and I'm not sure if folks are in tune, but one topic of that you just mentioned, is it Jordan, right? Sorry, I can't see your full name. I just see your email.
Yes, Jordan.
Okay, hi Jordan, I remember you.
Hi.
Is about children, so children of color, period, whether Asian, Indian, Black, being raised by white folks. What does that look like? Right? And so can they really prepare them for the world, or are they making them colorblind? Look up that. Right. Add that to your list, right? Because you can't raise your child like you don't see color. When your child's skin tone, the world will judge them just on their skin tone. So although you're raising them like that, they're going to be treated as other, right? And so, oh my gosh, just so I could talk all day about that. Let me move on in the essence of time. These two, oh my gosh, this is a whole workshop in itself. But I want to make sure that I mention them in the space. But these are two pieces that get really sticky when I have these conversations and I stop on white fragility. I thought about just doing a white fragility workshop, but I was like, no. But if anyone wants to ever have dialogue about it, I want to bring it up and for you to put it here. These are little gems I'm just putting here, or nuggets. I like to call them nuggets. So white fragility is basically when white folks get super uncomfortable with talking about race and do everything not to talk about it, right? So that's whether you change the subject, you cry, you get defensive, right? You pretty much make an inappropriate joke at the wrong time. That's when it's heated in the topic about racism. And because of your privilege, right, you're able to like pivot and be like, I'm out, right? And so it's one of those things that as a person of color, I don't get to pick which day I want to think about racism, because I think about it every day, right? And so really asking yourself, like, do you take the exit, right? Do you take the exit when it's time to talk about these issues, right? Are you only talking about them when you're made to, so you can check the box? So really think about that and look that up if that's something you're interested in, as well as the white savior complex, right? I can remember growing up, I don't know if anyone is old enough to remember, but I never understood. I asked my mom about the commercials of the kids in Africa. They will always have like big bellies. They really have no clothes on, and it would be a white person, and they would be on a commercial. And I'm just like, Mom, like I can remember, that's the first thing I remember, like watching TV, and I'm just like, why is this white person like with these kids? Like, why they don't have food? It used to be flies flying around them. But if anyone is familiar with those, that was like my first introduction to this, but now understanding it. But it's feeling like as a white person, you need to save, right, people of color. So, you know, I just always like to remind, like, we don't need to be saved. Like, what we need is someone that's in it with us. I like to call that person an accomplice more than an ally. Like, we are planning a heist together and you're the getaway driver. So you're in it with me no matter what happens. And so kind of resisting lots of things, but resisting what feels good. So have you ever like had someone do you wrong and they fixed it in a way that they wanted it to be fixed? And you're like, dog, that's not even what I wanted, right? You know, so really like thinking about how white folks show up for people of color. Are you asking, or are you kind of just doing your own thing? Does that make sense? Anyone feel me? Had someone fix something the wrong way? Y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all don't want to say it. Okay, good. So really thinking about that. And so all of those are there. So those two really important concepts, please put those in your repertoire and make sure you go back to them because they're super important. All right, so let's jump into some examples and then we're going to kind of do our ending thing. So I'm going to fly through these, but I just want to make sure, oh, sorry, they're going to come one by one. Let me go back. I just want to make sure that I mentioned them, and then as you look at these ways to kind of resist everyday racism, that means every day in your classes, with your family, at the dinner table, with your friends, think about what you can do, right? And so what I'm going to ask on the last slide is ways that you personally identify you can resist everyday racism, right? And so I'm gonna go through these as just some examples. So the first one is listen when people of color talk about racism and white privilege. So sometimes it's easy to change the subject or like shut them down or think they're angry, but actually really listening and like how important that is. honoring the feelings of people of color in a discussion, and really not focusing on your white guilt. I think sometimes I get friends so guilty that it stops them, kind of stops or stalls, that's not even a word, but stops them from like action, right? And so don't focus on like, you're so sad that slavery happened, like, right? No, let's focus on what we can do here and now. And so really honoring people's feelings and then figuring out how you can do this. So this one is a little twofold, but asking plenty of questions, but really seeking to understand before kind of having your viewpoint understood. But I will say that sometimes people of color are like exhausted, because I'm pretty much sometimes exhausted, but since I do this for a living, like I feel like I have a larger capacity than do some of my friends or colleagues, but definitely asking questions, and really, I'm going to talk about it, but like educating yourself, which is, you know, this last one, educating yourself as much as you can before you ask all of the questions, right? What education have you done? White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is the #1 book that you should get. And we're going to send out a couple of book recommendations after the workshop. But read a book, right? In terms of really delving into that. This one is one I love. I don't know if any folks have a good example, but challenging other white people, right? So a lot of students, they're at college, they're talking, they're working through these things. And then I think like my friend talked about, you go back home and then it's like, you don't talk about racism at all. You know, your uncle or your grandpa may make a racist joke, but like, do you ever like confront them? Has any anyone vulnerable enough to share a time when they confronted another white person on their stuff? Yes, tell us about it.
I have something to say about that. Actually, it's not really nothing crazy, but about a couple of days ago in my economics class, we have a group chat, and most of them are white, different backgrounds. But our teacher, he might be Jamaican or African, either one. He has a really, really strong accent. And I don't know why, but they were joking a lot. And someone made a comment, and it was like, would he be offended if I turned on my camera and I bowed down or I knee down for Black Lives Matter? And he said it while they were joking. I had responded, I said, it will only be offensive if you're not being serious about it.
Right.
So everyone else got quiet after that. It was kind of weird, because it's like, it's not a joking matter, and right now it's a sensitive situation where stuff is happening. So if you are going to play, I don't think you should do that, because it might offend people who are African American.
Yes.
So that's one thing that I experienced.
Right. And so people joking about it, right? And it's not a joking matter, right? And so, all right, so let me move on. Yeah. Directing peers towards perspectives of people of color. So reminding them that being a savior is like not what we're here for. Like, we're here to like talk and help. And please come to Allyship 101, because I'm going to really delve into allyship, because I have a lot of thoughts about how people claim to be allies, but I really feel like they're just doing it just because. Avoid conflating other oppressions with racism. So I hear people tell me all the time, like, oh my gosh, like, I understand how you feel, like, so white gay friend understanding how I feel as a Black person. You can't conflate like homophobia and racism, like they don't even have the same historical representation. So don't try to like compare, right? So I think that's something that people do. They try to like connect. I think ways to connect is simply to listen and be there and educate yourself. So a couple more. If you make a mistake, ask people of color how you can fix it, right? A lot of people, when they make a mistake or they offend someone, they tend to shut down and then they stop the action piece of it. Thinking about intersectionality, right? So the intersectional aspect of our identities. How does this tie in with religion, physical ability, social economic class, which we know is true, right? People of color who have a caliber of money are very different. And so within the communities of color, there's class, right? There is some parts of Philadelphia people would say they don't want to live in. Who's from Philly? Where my Philly people at? All right, so what do we know as the bad part of Philly?
North Philly. North Philly.
You say you live in North Philly, people say you live in a hood. All right, now what could be a good part of Philly?
Chestnut Hill.
Yeah, so yeah, like if
Edmonton.
yeah, right outside. I live on the outskirts of Philly, right? You know, so it's a different level. People are like, oh, you got money. You live in Abington, you know. But then if you live in North Philly, you have to live in the hood, if that makes sense. I grew up in a 3-story house, which was around the corner from the project. So when I told people I lived in South Philly, they was like, oh, you know, what part of South Philly? So all my Philly people, right? But thinking about where you come from and then how this all plays into it. All right, and then one more: openly calling out and rejecting all white privilege. Like anything you witness and experience, call it out. It's like a kid. If anyone has brothers or sisters, if you let them get away with it one time, they'll be like, "Oh, you didn't say anything last week." Like, you know, no, say it when it happens. Don't wait. It's super, super important. All right. So I love this. Sorry, the font isn't too good, but it's by an amazing feminist, and it says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. Meaning, like, we can't be free, you can't be free until we're all free, right? And so really thinking about that. All right, so this is the last piece. I want to leave it here as we end. And then I have some resources, but I'm going to send this out on the next slide. So that was a lot. I've been talking for 47 minutes, but I want to stop here and I want you to kind of think about like everything I said. And if you can really, I would like you to focus on what impacted you the most. Maybe what did you learn that you didn't know, or maybe contribute something that I didn't talk about, because I didn't talk about everything, right? And so I want to take some folks. I want to hear from you. I'm done talking. I want some folks to talk who haven't talked as well. All right, who's first?
So I'll say something. I don't know how to put it into words, but one thing that I never thought about before that we talked about now was the commercial part that you talked about with the kids in Africa and then the white people trying to help, and that how when you said that it's not your job to help, it's your job to be there with with the person that needs help. So that's something that I never thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're saving us, then you're still putting yourself in your power above, right? You should be right beside, and we're working together. And that's how it works. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Who else? Come on. Tell me what you thought.
I can throw up something. In a way, for the first question, names list something to push back against your privilege. I usually do this specifically when I'm doing something that I enjoy doing. When I say like I'm hanging out with friends, or I'm going out to eat, or something that you would normally, I feel, take for granted almost in a way. Usually if that happens and I'm being conscious about where I am and what I'm doing, I'll take a second to acknowledge that, you know, there are people in the world that don't have the ability or the opportunity to do what I'm doing in that instance. So, I mean, the first step to pushing back against your privilege, I guess, is to acknowledge where you have privilege and how it kind of functions in your life.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's so great. Thanks for bringing up going to eat, because I can do a whole workshop on this too. So I was a server for 13 years. I don't know if anyone else is about the restaurant life, but so many things goes into that. Like, so pushing back on your privilege would mean if you are at a restaurant and you know that there's a table of people of color that sat down way before you and you get waited on first, that you actually bring up, like, they were here before me. Right. But I don't know if you all know, but in some restaurants, especially depending on where you're at, people take like bets on who wants to take the Asian table, right? Or the table with the Black folks or the Indian folks, because they don't know how to tip. Like, this is real life. Like, I was in the kitchen a many a day, and some of my coworkers were kind of like raffling off who they wanted, who wanted the table, and like calling them names and stuff based on how they tip. And what we know is that like all people of color don't tip the same way, right? But tipping in different cultures are different. But calling it out. Thank you, Crystal. Who else? Come on, I want to hear from some folks I haven't heard from. Y'all lucky I can't see all of your names. Thoughts?
No.
What impacted you most? Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I've been trying like to participate multiple times, but like my microphone wasn't working. My name is Mansoura, and I'm a student here. So the most thing like that affected me personally is that like I think like most of the people, if not all, are like biased against some group in somehow. So I've been like having this idea for a long time, but like I haven't like really heard someone say it. So I'm glad like you have sent us that preparing for this dialogue, and I think like that's a good point because like most of it, people say that I'm not racist, but they are like in some way for like they are biased against some group in some way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think like it's a good thing to like admit that in some way and accept it and try to fix it. I get like instead of denying it.
Yep. I mean, even just look at what's happening in this world right now in 2020 when COVID-19 first started. And y'all might not want to keep it real with me right now, but when it first started, like people would treat Asian people like they were the only ones that could have COVID-19, right? So anyone you seen, it was just like, oh, they're from China. Like they had, they have it. Like it's, this big disease because that's how it kind of started out, that it came from China. But the way we treated Asian folks and whatever way we considered them, it was biased. People were biased, clearly. We had a faculty on campus ask an Asian student to leave when they coughed, right? And so really leave the classroom. And so how we treat people, we all have some form of bias, and sometimes it's informed by what's really going on. And so it's not just against Black folks, right? Racism stems so more, but bias against all types of folks. I told you, well, I didn't tell you all that I was married, but you saw my beautiful wedding picture. But me and my wife go places, and some people treat us indifferent when they find out we're married. Sometimes we don't tell people we're married, right? So absolutely, bias that goes all over, and we all have some type of bias. All right, let me hear from two more people. We're going to wrap up. Who else? What are you thinking? What are you thinking out there?
Something. I think like what stood out to me was how you said like when you're uncomfortable, that's when like the best thing is probably going to be happening. Because like I think that is a big reason that people would rather not say something, because like it is uncomfortable, and it's like why would you put yourself in that situation? But like it's worth it because that's how you make change. So yeah.
Yeah, that's how you make change. And like I said, I'm imploring you all, like especially in this virtual world, I'm so happy to see so many students here. I don't know if y'all here because y'all getting extra credit, or y'all here because you just are really invested in these topics. But get out into these virtual spaces and meet people that are different than you. Like you want to have that. So the resources are here. That's the book I talked about, as well as some sites that I just love. But it's so many different things out there, as well as we are building a social justice at Abington page on Engage. Hopefully you all are on Engage. And so there'll be lots of resources coming out to continue to support your learning. But please check out our calendar of events. If you are not following us on social media, please be following us on social media at O'Dea PSU Ab. Our office is employed by 11 amazing student ambassadors, and they really helped me do this great work. And so we hope to see you soon. We're going to be talking about lots of different topics coming up, but your voice matters, right? We have this thing called Courageous Conversations, where we students just get together and literally just talk about topics that matter, and no kind of formal thing, but we've covered everything from politics to race to sexual orientation. So there's so many ways to continue these conversations, but don't let it stop here. So be sure that you are, for me, I have a short attention span, so I like YouTube videos that are short, and small articles, but mainly I just like talking to you all in your experiences. All right, let's get one more comment to end our session. Anyone want to leave us with one final thought or comment?
I think for me, the thing about like saving people, like we said, that was like that was like really big. Like I think because I always want to help anyone like any way that I can, but maybe instead of like trying to save them, we should be like thinking of them as like equals and not like that's still all like the privilege and power. Like if I'm like saving them, then it's like putting me like over them still, because making me feel good about doing something.
Yes,
But
Ethan, you got it. Yeah. So we still want you to help, but we just want to be included on like how you're helping, right? If it's an issue that deals with, specifically race, and race and ethnicity are two different things. So I want to like say that as well. So be sure that we know that race is about skin color, and colorism, which is something that exists in many of our people of color communities, is something that I'm going to talk about. It's really a big thing, but making sure we just know the difference between race and ethnicity, and not everyone that's brown skin is black, right? And so really thinking about that, and not everyone that's fair skin is white. I don't make any assumptions that people are white. Right? I always ask, like, let me know. There's some Latinx folks that are white, that are whiter skin. And so you never know. But it's been such a pleasure being here with you all today. Please stay in touch with us, and please let us know, how we can help, or if you're experiencing things in the classroom, out the classroom. O'Day is here, and that's what we do. So I want to just thank you, all my colleagues that I see on the call. Thanks for being here in support of this great conversation. I did record this, so I will definitely send you all the link to the recording. You can share it or watch it again if you want to, but the best part of this was all of you. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.